Hello and welcome to Comic Boom, the comics and education podcast. If you're interested in hearing more about the crossover between comics and education, then this is the podcast for you. My name is Lucy Starbuck-Bradley, and each week I'll be joined by a fellow educator, an academic, a librarian, or a creator of comics to discuss their journey into comics and provide some inspiration to influence your practice. And hopefully as well shine some light on some titles that you can bring into your classrooms, your libraries, and your bookshelves at home as well. This week I'm joined by a writing duo, very excited, not just one writer but two writers on the podcast and writers who write together as well. I'm joined by Beth Garrod and Jess Hitchman, creators of the Inflatables series. Beth is the author of this super awkward series. After growing up in Worcester, UK, she's worked all around the world, including the USA, India, South Africa and Canada, producing everything from mental health campaigns to music TV shows. She now lives in East London and splits her time between writing and social impact campaigns that help to inform and empower young people. Jess Hitchman started her career as an online agony aunt on a .com boom website for teenage girls, and since then she's worked for youth and entertainment brands, including CBeebies, CBBC, lots of names that you would recognise. And Jess talks a little bit about that today and how it influenced her writing. Jess is the author of picture books, Ava in Codeland, and all kinds of awesome, as well as In Every House on Every Street. And together, Jess and Beth are the co-creators and writers of graphic chapter book, The Inflatables, which is published by Scholastic. And we talk about that a lot today. It's illustrated by Chris Danger. And again, we unpick that relationship a little bit in our conversation. There are a number of Inflatables titles available. I really enjoyed reading them. They're black and white inside, which will be very familiar if you're a manga reader to have black and white content inside of a comic. But it might be something new if you're used to reading colour graphic novels. So something to give a try. The books are very funny. Beth and Jess are very funny. You could definitely hear that humour coming through in the interview. They've got a great relationship. It was lovely to hear them discuss their working relationship and collaboration together and help us to find out a little bit more about what it's like to be a writer of comics. So here's what Beth and Jess had to say. Hello, Beth and Jess. Welcome to Comic Boom.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, you are very welcome. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for inviting us on.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're excited.
You're our first writing duo to be on the podcast. I'd really like to find out a little bit more about your journey as comics readers. Beth, first of all, where did that all start for you? Are you a comics reader? It's very presumptuous. And if so, when did that start?
Well, I mean, I'm going to go way back. I don't know how many people have already said this to you, but I was actually in the fan club for the Beano, and I had the furry sort of Nashma and Nipper badges. And that was just a massive part of my childhood, really, but I didn't know sort of where it would lead, and I think we'll probably talk about it a bit more later, but I didn't know graphic novels were going to be on our radar at all. So it's been a really full circle thing, and it's also something we're learning more about and discovering more about as we go.
And what do you think it was that appealed to you about the Beano?
So is that too old? Am I too old? Should I have said something a bit more?
Lots of people mentioned Beano, and in fact, excitingly, Beano are going to be on this series, so it's all very relevant.
I think it felt really for me. You know, it felt like something that was, when I got it, it didn't feel like something that anyone else in my family would be interested in. It felt like my own cool thing, and I loved some of the female characters in there, Minnie the Minx, and I loved the dogs, and I also really liked the variety. So there was lots of stuff. Some of it wasn't for me and some of it I absolutely loved. And it just felt a bit sort of special, and it felt current and topical, and it just felt a bit naughty as well, I think, compared to some of the books that I was reading.
Yeah, definitely. And Jess, what about you?
Same, I'm afraid. Beano was the thing, really. Joined the club, got the badges. I remember my dad one time bringing home the Dandy, and it just wasn't the same. So I was a big fan of the Beano. I loved Banana Man, and I always forget whether Banana Man was in the Beano or the Dandy or on its own.
He was in Beano.
He was Beano back then. I loved Banana Man, and then when I got a bit older, I got really into the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I mean, to be totally honest, it was as much about the TV and the toys. And,
yeah, for sure.
And the Sega
that
games.
whole thing.
Yeah, it was such an amazing world. And I think I was quite a bit older. I think I was like heading on to the teen years there. But I did have the comics as well. And then really had a big gap, I would say, in comics until I started reading graphic novels with my kids.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So now, now they're great. I love, we read quite a lot. We got started on Narwhal and Jelly, which is just so funny and so cute. And I think because my youngest started with that, she was always just on the lookout for graphic novels. So we kind of upgraded to the Catstronauts, is a really big favourite in our family. But yeah, there was probably, 20 years longer, 30-year gap in between the two, but back into it now.
And there's so much variety out there now as well. Beth, what are you reading at the moment? Anything particularly sparking joy for you that's out there currently for children or adults in terms of comics?
Oh, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
What would you say is a differentiator between like comics and graphic novels? So I want to answer the question right.
I would say that graphic novels are comics, but they're just longer form comics. So everything can be called comics, but a graphic novel's got a thicker spine, there's a longer story.
Because I sort of think that, but then sometimes you go into bookshops and they're called one thing, sometimes they're called another, and it's like I just find it kind of interesting that everyone has their own take on it. I think both Jess and I really love Agent Moose. We just think it's like a really fab series for kids. And I haven't read it yet, but I really want to get my hands on 12th Grade Night. Don't know if you've seen it, but it's like a graphic novel retelling that's like a high school 12th night.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it looks really good. So that's the one I'm looking to get my hands on next.
So really interesting, the kind of humour element linking with the Beano as well. Was that really important when you started writing to capture a little bit of that naughtiness and that kind of humour?
Not directly. We never thought of it, did we, Beth? But I guess all of your influences come in somehow. And as soon as we started writing, we did find some kind of common ground on things that were just sort of cheeky and ridiculous. And I think the big thing for both of us has always been friendship-based stories. Inflatables are really about friendship. And obviously that's partly, our friendship coming across. But I'm sure that does sort of trace back to our, the comics and TV shows that we liked as a kid. Because looking at the Beano, there's so many different themes of friendship coming through there.
I think in fairness, we never sort of said, this is what we definitely want to do. But you spend so much time writing books, you have to really enjoy it. And I think Jess and I, when we hang out, we always have a really fun time. And so that was always going to be the kind of book that we would write, is something that made us laugh. Sometimes we worry it doesn't make anyone else laugh other than ourselves. But we try and give it a good go.
Beth, for anyone who's listening who hasn't had a chance to explore the Inflatables world yet, can you introduce it a little bit to the listeners?
Oh, why did you ask me, Jess? Don't judge me. It's totally wrong. The Inflatables is about a bunch of abandoned pool floats. Well, I guess that's what they say in America, pool floats. Have a great spray water park. So you've got flamingo, donut, cactus, watermelon, and you've got someone who's been there, done that, got the puncher. That's Lynn. And they get up to all sort of adventures in the water park and beyond, and it's funny, it's sort of pumped full of humour, and it's just full of their adventures. And I guess sort of underneath it all is a little bit about as long as they've all got each other, they can always sort of find a way through. They don't have to be the newest, the flashiest, the best, but they always find their way through. Jess, I don't think I did that very well. Could you please?
I'm so glad you asked Beth, Lucy. That was perfect. Why do we find it hard to describe our own books, Beth?
I don't know. Why had we not just written that down and read it out? I don't know.
Just for the listeners, people do have access to the questions in advance, so why people aren't prepared, I don't know.
I think we thought it'd be better if we were more casual, and then you ask the proper questions. They were set, and with plenty of warning too. So.
One thing that I'm really interested in, particularly in the educational context, and I think when we're talking about teaching children about writing, and when you're writing in a school context, it's much more a solitary kind of exercise. And I think from what I've learned from over the course of this podcast series is just that actually in the real world, the creation of a book, even if it's just one author, is involving lots and lots of different people. It's really teamwork, but even more so this sort of collaborative pairing. So I really want to dig into that today. How did this come about, this pairing? When did you start just decide to work together?
Yeah, so
I was nodding a lot then, by the way, but you can't see it.
For the record, Beth nodded.
Yeah.
So Beth and I worked, when we first met, we were working together in a job. We worked at Radio 1 together. And I think we always had little side projects. That was how we connected, really, just having creative ideas and kind of wanting to make them happen. And we had lots of little failed ideas along the way. And then independently both started writing about 10 years later. And Beth writes really long books. She writes novels. I write very short kind of picture books. And so we just had an idea that, one day we should try and meet in the middle. I still don't think I could ever write anything as long as Beth does, and she was interested in finding out more about writing for younger kids, and so we just sort of settled on this age range basically that's right in between what she does and what I do. And then we had the idea for a while, didn't we? And then it was just waiting for the right time, schedules and things that we could get down and start writing it. But it was so fun. We already have such a kind of common language. So I think it would be fun to write with someone new as well. I think that could push you. But for me and Beth, we just know each other inside out. I mean, we really do. We text multiple times every day, and it feels weird if a couple of days goes past and we don't. So writing this just felt, it did feel really natural. But we still, we had to work out our processes and how it was actually going to get beyond just us having a giggle about random inflated objects.
And Beth, what does that look like in reality? What is the actual process of how I'm assuming it's not one word alternating one person inside of you.
I would love that.
How does it work?
Well, we, like Jess said, we sort of really found our feet with it. And also, just to sort of add on to something that Jess said as well about, it taking a while. It can be really embarrassing when you put a new idea out into the world, especially if you've already done something. And I think we've both got the same agent. And Jess, I don't know if you'd agree with this. If you don't, make a loud noise and we can edit it out. But it also felt like, imagine if this is absolutely wild and we've lost our heads here. So it takes a while to actually press send on it, because you just think, oh goodness, how are they going to politely tell us that we've really missed the mark? So we kept saying to our agent, we have this sort of thing, it's all about a band of inflatables at a water park. But she was super supportive. Jess, would you say that was true? There was a bit of nervousness around it too.
I think we still ask ourselves every book, probably every chapter, have we completely lost it at this point? People are probably reading this and people probably read it and think, it's very boring, why would you consider that? But we just sometimes wonder and sometimes we do go too far, and definitely we do have an amazing editor and an amazing agent to just rein us back in.
Do you find that you are generally of one mind about things, or are there ever disagreements or things that you have to kind of negotiate?
I realised I absolutely didn't answer your question about process, so maybe I'll try and answer that and then sort of touch on this, which is we found our feet, and when we first wrote it, I think it's probably okay to say it was a chapter book, not a graphic novel, and it was our amazing editor that was like, have you thought about this? And we hadn't thought about this because neither of us, Jess is an incredible sort of illustrator, but she doesn't illustrate her own books. So we weren't really in that world yet, so we were like, we hadn't thought about a graphic novel. And then we sort of figured out the process. And I don't know how interesting this is to someone. Maybe this is super boring, but it's very much a shared Google Doc. We very much got that chapter breakdown together. That often takes the longest thing. And what we found works well now is to really have an idea of the chapters and then sort of divide them up, and then just constantly sort of go back and I just leave spaces where I need to write jokes. I just put XXX or need to make funny in capital letters, whereas Jess actually manages to plough through and get everything down. And we've both got really different sort of styles, and Jess is really great at getting a story across really quickly and being super funny, and I can be really long-winded and derail into different areas. But we sort of get it all down, agree that, no judgment. We're really supportive of each other, and we're really critical of ourselves. And then we jump into each other's and just try and add comments and things and just layer it up, I guess. But we found that process just, I guess, naturally, really. And it seems to work, right, Jess?
Yeah, it works great. I think in terms of arguments or disagreements, we've both got a real mutual adoration for our editor, Jenny. So if we're ever interested in going in two different routes, we just leave it to Jenny, and she just comes in. And however strongly I cared about my original route, it's like, yeah, Jenny knows best. And so that it's great to have this extra person to just kind of decide it for us. Although I will say, I don't know if I should bring this up, Beth, we once had a really big argument about goggles.
Oh yeah, we did. Goggles, yeah.
That's still kind of ongoing, really.
It's ongoing. Like, all I can say is Jess is a very big fan of the adult goggle wearer. Yeah, I didn't know that goggles were so predominant in the adult swimming field, but I think Jess is just more Olympic level with her swimming.
Lucy, you don't want to get chlorine in your eye, do you? Gotta have the goggles on.
Thanks, Lucy. Sounds like you're on my side.
Team goggles.
There we go.
Look, I support everyone wearing goggles when they want to wear goggles. I don't think we really disagree that much, and I think there are times when one of us will want something the other doesn't, or thinks it's funny it isn't, and we sort of, I think we'll both let most things slide because we sort of both listen to each other, and occasionally there'll be something which is like, oh, I really love this, so then we're like, okay, cool. Like, we're both just, I think, quite reasonable about it and find a middle ground. And I often really care about things. I'm like, I cannot be a hedgehog. And then the next day I'm like, oh no, I've slept on it. I totally think it definitely, yeah, thanks, Jess. You're totally right.
Are you ever in the same place physically, or is this all online? Do you get together, kind of sit in a cafe and have a brainstorm? Or
we do a bit of everything. So definitely near the beginning, we wrote a couple of these in lockdown, and we would do all day on a screen share. We would even leave it on, when we were going away to write our separate bits. And then now we'll be texting about everything normal in our day-to-day lives, plus a cheeky question about whether Flamingo should, be wearing goggles or in the next chapter. So we have meetups sometimes. It's nice at the beginning of the book, I would say, to spend quite a lot of time together. So while we're just defining exactly what the story is and making sure that we're both super, super happy, we would never sort of go into the writing phase until we both loved it. So that's a really good time to chat together. But then we will do a chapter each, and we'll kind of go off separately and do a chapter. And then we will edit each other's chapter and really kind of get it to the point where they hopefully sound like they've come from kind of the same voice.
And we've learned stuff along the way. So we will write the illustration notes and then write the sort of dialogue. And I think what we tried to get better at, and this was a learning for us, is that not to have too much on every page, not be like panel 29 and then everything's tiny and you can't really see any of the great work that our illustrator Chris Danger has done because it's so small. So we tried to sort of let the art breathe a bit more, but that's because I guess we were coming from it from the writing side, and once we'd done the first book, we were like, oh yeah, okay, yeah. And the other thing is I think we tried to get better at letting the art tell some of the story, whereas originally we were sort of writing it all. Actually, we can sort of let the pictures do the talking and the story driving as well. So we tried to I think that's something that we've learned and tried to sort of improve along the way, but also we love our illustrator, and when he sends stuff back, it's sort of funnier and more jokes than we could have imagined. So it's about sort of giving that the space as well.
And so you work with Chris Danger. That was one of my next question was about Chris, and at what point does he get involved? And was that sort of a matchmaking that happened with the publishers, or were you already aware of his work?
Yeah, so that was a pairing by Jenny, our editor. She sent over Chris's work near the beginning of the project, and we loved it. He's so funny, so expressive, and just brings so much to it all. We don't talk to him directly, but we, via our illustration notes, that's kind of really writing for Chris. So for each panel, we'll kind of do a little description. And like Beth said, at the beginning, we'd be much more prescriptive about it, and then getting to know Chris's style and how much extra humour he injects into it. We've tried to start leaving them a little bit open, and we'll sometimes even say in those notes, or anything that Chris thinks of, or, a list of things that might pop in Inflatables, whereas previously we would have said exactly what they all are. And sometimes we'll just leave it because we know that Chris will bring something really funny along. And then we get like the first draft of illustrations. We'll have a look through, and he'll sometimes pass on some comments to us and questions. We'll pass them back via the notes. So, but we follow him on Instagram, and he's really funny. So we feel connected, even though a lot of that does happen via the publisher.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And what was it like, Beth, the first time you got those character designs and started to see what the actual finished book might look like?
Well, I think I think we're similar, Jess and I, but also different in that I'd never had any illustrations for any of my books at all at this point. So I was completely not used to it. And it was just really exciting.
But it never gets old, and it's still an absolute joy to see something that you've invented, be brilliantly illustrated like that.
Yeah. And sometimes we write stuff now, like every book we really enjoy getting the artwork back. It is just always a real treat. It's like, oh, it's in quick. And there's just some scenes that you just know are going to be, you're just really excited to get to that page just to see how they come out. And often we just think, oh yeah, poor Chris. Like, we wrote this thing and it makes no sense. Like, how can you have an inflatable this with that doing this at that time and it all somehow makes sense? And he just somehow does make sense for all. And it's just, it's real. It's just a real treat and I love it. And I think I know you talked at the start about in education sort of writing on your own. And I think, writing on your own is one thing, but writing with Jess and then having Chris on board, having, people like Jenny, like just a real trusted bunch of people who you think are brilliant. It's just so much fun. And I would just really recommend it to anyone. If they have someone that they enjoy working with or, think is great, then it's a really lovely thing to do as a job, is spend time with your friend and write about things that make you laugh and have someone brilliant bring them to life. So yeah, 10 out of 10, no notes.
I would skip ahead to a little bit more of an in-depth question on that about your experience of writing in school. Do you think it prepared you for the life as a writer or things that could have been different for you? I just think it's really interesting to hear from professionals about that kind of journey that they went on in education. So Jess, I don't know if you can start us off. Did you like writing at school? Were you super into it, or was that something that came later?
Yeah, I did like it. I do remember I did like writing poems at school. I liked making things rhyme. I do remember the feeling of enjoying it. I think the one thing that I don't think I came out of school thinking I wanted to be a writer or that I was particularly good at it. The one thing that I do think, and maybe schools do it a little bit more now, but that was a bit difficult was the timed, the kind of scenario of being given 10 minutes, come up with your idea, and then, you're kind of stuck with that for 2 weeks. And if I think about how I write now, I could never do that. The ideas, they, as cliche as it sounds, they come in the bath or they come on a walk or, when you're doing, chopping a salad. So I don't think that's really replicated in schools, or it wasn't when I was at school. It might be much better now. But then, that feeling of you had such a specific time to come up with your idea and then you might be stuck with that idea for a week and you kind of hate it, which feels like a bit of a shame and feels very different to the way I write now.
So when did you first start to think that being a writer might be something that you could be?
I think when I realised I didn't really enjoy anything else. So my first job, I worked at Children's BBC and I just wanted to be there. I wanted to be there for the Saturday morning shows. I think I was still just a kid, essentially. And writing, so I got a job on the website, which just kind of combined all the things that I was interested in. Because I always liked computer games and technology. And then I did like comics and, a bit of photography. So it really kind of brought everything together. But the writing, I think even then I had that same feeling. I remember I'd sort of sit at the desk and spend most of the day sort of trying to fill the day with the admin parts of the job and then try and have my ideas outside of the office. And I think now as you get like more experienced and you get, more senior, you've got sort of the confidence to say, right, this isn't working, I'm going for a walk, or this isn't working, I'm going, to sit outside for a bit. But when you first start a job, a bit like when you're in school, you have no power to kind of, I can't imagine any kids halfway through their classroom saying they need to go, get some inspiration. So I always wrote for my job, but I always worked in digital. So it was kind of writing little articles rather than necessarily coming up with fiction. And then that really just happened, like, I know it's a bit of a cliche as well, but when I had kids and I was just reading lots and lots of kids' books, having ideas. Yeah, and compared to other sort of ideas, so me and Beth had always had these ideas for like businesses and charities and ideas that were really difficult to make happen, without investment and all that kind of stuff. And then books, suddenly it was like, oh, you can have your idea and pretty much write it. And then it's, you send it off to someone and then it's a thing. So that was when it started. And I started with picture books. I'm doing a little bit of board book stuff now. But really, when I saw Beth writing longer things, I thought, oh, not sure if I could do that, but maybe we could together.
That's brilliant. And Beth, have you got any of your own reflections on education and its role in you becoming a writer?
So this is really interesting because like Jess and I haven't talked about this kind of stuff, so it's really interesting for me to hear that, Jess. I haven't reflected on this much, and I, like, to be really honest, don't think I loved writing at school because I don't think I ever really got the chance to write things that I enjoyed reading. And I often enjoy like contemporary, funny, very sort of everyday. And that's the books I write, sort of YA, middle grade stuff. And when I think back, when you just asked that question I think back to what I was writing at school, it's like quite serious. And I did some stuff out of school, like some plays and stuff in my spare time. But I just sort of assumed that was just, they weren't very good. Just didn't really think about it. And then did science at uni. And weirdly, similar to Jess, this was before I met Jess, ended up working at the BBC originally on their website for teenagers. And that's when I started writing stuff. And there was this amazing lady on the team called Ali Cronin. And she was an incredible writer. And then she wrote some brilliant books. And I just never thought of it. And then you meet someone who's doing it. Often with these worlds, they feel just a million miles away. You cannot imagine a route into them. And actually, you just sort of need to, it's different for everybody. But Ali was doing it. She was brilliant. And that was the first, and she was really supportive and encouraging. And that was the first time I thought, oh, well, that's a nice thing to say. And I do enjoy it. And that's when I ended up writing my first novel, was in my spare time. So I was doing less writing in my job. And then I then panicked and didn't do anything with it. And my mum said, oh, I knew you'd never do anything with it. So I was like, oh, fine, I will then, fine. And that's when I sent it to my agent. And that's sort of when it all started. But I think imposter syndrome is real. I think when I was young, thinking of being a writer feels like, oh, I have chosen this job and I have shown incredible skill at this craft. And like those things were never me or where I've got to. It was just like a series of events that led to this point. And I guess maybe that's important because you don't always have to know where you're going to end up when you're younger. You can sort of do things that you enjoy and see where it takes you, which is, I guess a privileged position. I meant sort of within the confines of still having to earn money and pay your mortgage and all those kind of things. Yeah. Writing for us was very much alongside the day job. So when Jess talks about schedules and things as well and how we write together, we don't live near each other. If we did, we'd see a lot more of each other, but we live like hours away from each other. And we're also trying to juggle the other things of life too. I think there's a bit of a miscomprehension that you can take a day and sit by the sea until you feel that your idea has manifested perfectly. And actually, it's like I've got 90 minutes now and I have to get this chapter, as much of it done as possible. So that was a very long I told you I was long and rambling, and Jess was good at being succinct with her story. I'm sorry.
No, it was a good lengthy answer. It was really interesting. And have you ever done any author visits? Have you now gone back into schools as writers to talk about your work? Is that something that you've done before?
When Jess and I said we used to work on websites and TV shows and stuff, is that you go in and you have all these prepared things, and basically everyone in that room is way funnier. So it's a really nice thing to do, but it's also really lovely because there's just like people there, like young people there, like brimming with ideas, brimming with jokes. It's just like a real pleasure to hear them. And like on the website stuff, we used to write things. I don't know about you, Jess. And then the inbox and the comments that we got back from young people were like hundreds of times funnier than we could have ever written. And I think that's just a really nice thing to get to be around. So school visits are fun, and it's nice to do something that feels a little bit more like they can let loose, I guess.
At the end of the podcast, I ask guests to pick out some key takeaways that might, just things for teachers to think about that might help to influence their practice. I don't know if you've got any suggestions, if there's anyone who wants to go first, or things, could be summarising things that we've already talked about, could be kind of new points to bring to the table.
Yeah, so I think the collaboration thing is really, and the fun of us working together, I think it's really important. And I'm sure lots of classrooms do incorporate that. But just in case they don't, I do think, you can find, other people that can push you and compliment you. So I think that's worth trying a bit more in classrooms. I also think just worrying less about the format. So I hope now that there isn't you'll know better than me, but there isn't such a kind of issue with graphic novels being seen as lesser. But I think even beyond that, just not worrying about format at all. I think kids don't see it that way. They're moving through their Roblox games after watching a movie after reading the book. And I think it's character and story that is where the messages come from. And I understand there needs to be some limit on video games, but they're also so valuable, or can be. And I think that suggestion of graphic novels not being as intellectual sort of just comes from that mindset of over focusing on the format rather than what is the story here and what is the character. I think that's really important. And then just the thing that I was saying earlier about the inspiration, and because I worry that kids who don't have a really quick idea are going to potentially think that they're not good at this, and so allowing that extra time at the beginning, I think, would be really nice and would give some more kids an opportunity to discover where their strengths lie.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I was just thinking when you were talking about the collaboration. So one of the episodes this season is with a researcher, Helen Jones, and she runs children's comics writing workshops in a comics club in a school, and that's what she's sort of focusing her research on. And she was talking about how in the comics club the children will sort of write in small groups, and that also that they're doing exactly what you're saying, like they will take things from other inspiration from their life, like from a computer game they really like, or something like films that they've seen, and then adapt to make it their own and kind of reflect, and also kind of comment on it in their writing, kind of change it, notice things that are maybe they don't like about it and change that, and then that they take that ownership of whatever they're consuming out in the world, and then can use their writing as a way to kind of process that and think about it more and sort of make a comment on it.
And I think also working in a group as well, because a lot of writers, me and Beth definitely don't do this, but a lot of writers, will do improv, and that's how they come up with their stories. And, Beth and I will kind of, when we're reading it back, we'll take turns to do the dialogue, and, sometimes just, the way you speak something helps you find something else. So there may be some kids that's their way of writing, is like, which could, potentially only happen in a group, and finding the dialogue. And it's such a early, when you're first writing, very common to make all your characters kind of sound the same. But the aspect of working in a group and, hearing people's speech, and if they're reading out the dialogue, and particularly with graphic novels where it's so sort of dialogue focused, I think, it just could be much richer sometimes if you do it as a group. Obviously, there'll be lots of kids and people who prefer to work independently as well, but just to have it as an option, really.
Beth, have you got anything that you'd like to bring in at this point?
I totally agree with everything Jess said, especially about like the collaboration, because I think if people think of being a writer, they think of this quite sort of lonely thing, and it really isn't. I think the other thing is like on a point of reassurance, which is if Jess and I sent out the first draft of something we wrote, we would be absolutely mortified. And I know that everyone sort of knows this, but it's okay to get something. We always call it like our vomit draft, like just get something down and you can make it better. And it doesn't have to be brilliant the first time round, and that's okay. You can come back to something. And I think the other thing, and again, I don't want to, as Jess said, say that this isn't happening, because there's like loads of incredible teachers, and my experience was so long ago. But I think there's no shame in writing what you enjoy, and there's no one way to be a writer. It's I guess reflecting a bit on that format thing as well. You don't have to write like an opus or a sci-fi fantasy like Odyssey. You can write jokes about a dog that make you laugh, and they will still bring a reader joy and happiness and give them a little break out of their day. So just making sure that the kids know that there's many different ways of doing something, and even though they might not feel they have the skills to get into X, Y, and Z, if they're making their friends laugh in the playground, they're probably a really good writer because they're a really good storyteller. They just might not see it that way because they might not feel that they have X, Y, and Z skill.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Yeah, that. And, I don't want to delve into sort of stereotypes, but, children who I taught when I was a teacher, there's many of them who are really, really funny. Always the person, the quickest person with, the quip, the first person to notice something that's gone wrong and alert the class to it, who sees those kind of moments. But I just think that's a really great way of like identifying that as a skill, that being funny is a skill. Something to celebrate.
I think, and I don't know how everyone else feels and sort of what gets taught, but when I handed in my first novel, my agent was like, "Oh my goodness, you've nailed the voice, but like, is there a story here?" And like, she helped me understand story structure, and she helped me understand lots of things that I didn't really have and understand before. And that was all about just getting voice right. So I think if if someone who's young can bring these characters to life, like Jess was saying, that's brilliant. And then you can sort of learn some of the other skills too. And I think there's room for lots of different people, lots of different skills is what I'm trying to say. And you can try and learn the bits around the edge and just not feel that it's not for you.
Yeah, I also like the idea that there might be teachers listening to this who maybe think that they can't, be writers, but listening to this podcast and listening to creators might be a way of them also unlocking or feeling confident to give something a go.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
So at the end of the podcast, we ask guests to recommend a comic or a book to add to their to-be-read piles. If we were going to add one book to our pile tomorrow, what would you recommend?
I'm just looking at the author of mine. Hold on.
I can actually hear you Googling.
Do you want to, I'll stop typing. Do you want to go, Beth? You got one in mind?
Can I just ask a question? Do you mean in the graphic novel space?
It doesn't actually matter. We've had people interpret it. When I first asked the question, I was thinking it would be a comic or a book about comics, but actually people have recommended all sorts, and that's fine.
Okay. So I'm a really big fan of the Catastronauts series. My daughter's really into space and science and all that stuff, and also really cute kittens. So that was like a kind of perfect combination for us if you think the kids in your classroom or at home may have a similar interest. It's a really great series. It's by Drew Brockington, and there's 6 of them. So you can keep,
perfect.
Yeah, that'll keep you busy. In the non-graphic novel category, I might be a bit late to this, so this might be really embarrassing and everyone knows and loves it, but we're just really getting into the Grimwood series by Nadia Shireen.
Yeah.
Does everyone know that
I love
one?
Nadia Shireen. She is a very funny person as
She's
well.
brilliant, and this series is just hilarious, so funny, and it's fiction, but it's got so many illustrations that it just feels to me that it has a sort of graphic novel kind of series, that some of the sensibilities are there. It's just really funny, really good.
Brilliant. Thank you for those. Beth, are you ready?
Yes, I am ready. I would say that in a graphic novel, I would say 12th Grade Night, because it's Shakespeare, it's funny, it's all the teen movies that I used to love, like in the 90s. It's 10 Things I Hate About You, and it's a graphic novel, and it's just sort of a really sort of more modern, inclusive retelling of it, which is lovely, and I think will sort of bring people to stories that might not have thought they were for them. And that's by Molly Horton Booth and Stephanie Kate Strom, and I think illustrated by Jamie Green. Sorry if I've got that wrong. I've just been reading a book that I absolutely loved, but it's an adult book, so I don't know if that's an okay recommendation.
Well,
Is that okay?
I want to know it. Give it. Yeah,
okay.
Come on, share.
On the sort of YA and middle grade, anything by Simon James Green I absolutely love, and his stuff at the minute is stellar. But for an adult rec, I've just read Harriet Gibson's Is This Okay?, which is all about sort of navigating life through, I guess, sort of the noughties, maybe 90s, but also through sort of social media and the internet and having access to everything all at once about people, and then how that feels when you sort of meet them in real life. So yeah, I don't know if any of those are useful. Sorry.
No, that sounds really interesting. Thank you. They are I'll definitely add them to my list. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming onto the podcast. You've been brilliant guests. It's been great to talk to you both. I really love your books. So yeah, thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. It's been really nice. So thank you.
Thank you, Beth and Jess. I really enjoyed that conversation. I found it so interesting to think a little bit more about the role that writing for pleasure can play in schools, how we can tap into that genuine inspiration that children might get outside of the classroom. I know it's often not possible when it comes to meeting the demands of the curriculum, but I think it's interesting to think about the ways it might be possible to develop writing for pleasure a little bit more, and the role that comics can play in that, whether it's through journaling, whether it's through clubs or opportunities to write outside of dedicated curriculum time. There's some definite things that can be teased out of that. I think it's really interesting. In my roundup today, I want to say a big thank you to listeners, because those of you who are connected with the podcast on Instagram and on Twitter will have seen me celebrating our 2000th download that happened this week. I'm really proud and grateful to listeners for their interest in the podcast. I had some great feedback on the back of those posts. One example here, Sam Creighton saying that this This is a podcast for anyone who's interested in education and or graphic novels. It's a total banger week on week. I shared it with my staff at school just a couple of weeks ago. So thanks, Sam, for that. I really appreciate that comment. Lots of other comments as well. If you do want to be up to date with things that are happening on the podcast, then Twitter and Instagram is a great place to do that. You can follow me on Twitter, which is at Lucy_Braidley, Braidley. And also you can follow the podcast on Instagram at comic_boom_podcast. From both of those, you'll find out who's on the podcast each week and also some different things about I'm reading, various stories and things like that. So it's a great way to keep up to date. And there's also a link in the show notes to the podcast Padlet, where everything that's discussed in each episode is kept. So if you don't quite catch anything or you can't remember something that someone's mentioned, you will find it there. And you can also, I've had some great feedback over the last few weeks about people using the transcripts for accessibility to the podcast. So there is that transcript of the conversation if you find it easier to read for whatever reason. I had a great weekend at LICAF last weekend. There's one more Lakes International Comics Art Festival themed episode coming up in a few weeks' time, and I'll give a roundup of what comics I picked up whilst I was at the festival, who I heard speaking, and I'll also be speaking to Mary Talbot, a patron of the festival, about her work and her relationship with it. So I'll give my recommendations, I'll save my recommendations for that bumper edition in a couple of weeks' time. As always, you can support the podcast if you'd like to, help keep us on the airwaves by going to ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/LucySB. There's an opportunity where you can buy some of my comics on there for adult readers, or you can also just put a few pennies in the pot for the podcast to keep us on the air. So thank you for that. Really appreciate your support. That's it for this week. You've been listening to Comic Boom, which is hosted and produced by me, Lucy Starbuck Braidley. Thanks for listening.